He stood before cameras with his hands folded. His voice was calm, his answers measured. He asked for prayers. He joined searches. He spoke of hope. And all the while, investigators were standing face to face with a man who had already ended his wife's life. This is a story of how help can be the perfect disguise, and how a killer didn't run from police. He walked beside them. In December 2002, Laci Peterson was 8 months pregnant. Friends describe her as warm, organized, and deeply excited about becoming a mother. She lived with her husband, Scott, in a quiet Modesto neighborhood where Christmas lights were going up and routines felt unbreakable. Scott Peterson fit the image of the devoted husband. He worked in fertilizer sales. He smiled easily. He spoke softly. He seemed, by all outward appearances, safe. On December 24th, Laci planned to walk the dog and finish holiday preparations. She never returned. By nightfall, panic spread. Family members gathered. Police arrived. And Scott, grieving husband, stepped forward to help. From the very beginning, Scott positioned himself as a cooperative presence. He answered questions. He joined vigils. He gave interviews pleading for Laci's safe return. "I just want her home," he said, eyes glistening. Investigators took note, not because he refused to help, but because he helped too well. He volunteered details before being asked. He corrected timelines. He offered explanations that seemed rehearsed. At the time, none of it was enough to accuse him, but it was enough to remember. As the days passed, Modesto mobilized. Hundreds searched parks, canals, and fields. Volunteers wore ribbons. Flyers appeared on telephone poles. Candlelight vigils filled the streets. Scott was always there. He hugged Laci's mother. He thanked searchers. He stood before microphones, asking strangers to pray. And behind the scenes, detectives began assembling a quieter picture, one that didn't match the performance. Investigators learned that Scott had told an acquaintance weeks earlier that he had lost his wife and would be spending his first Christmas alone. At the time he said this, Laci was still alive. When confronted, Scott dismissed it as a misunderstanding, a poor understanding of words, a coincidence. But coincidences, investigators knew, have a way of piling up. Scott claimed he had gone fishing alone on Christmas Eve at the San Francisco Bay, a detail that immediately raised eyebrows. It was cold, remote, and oddly specific. He said he returned home, found Laci missing, and called police. But timelines shifted. Phone records contradicted his statements. Witnesses reported seeing Laci walking the dog after Scott claimed to have left. Each discrepancy was small. Together, they formed a pattern. Scott never lashed out, never lawyered up, never refused a question. He was the opposite of what people expect a killer to be. That's what made him dangerous. Detectives later admitted, if he had panicked, if he had fled, if he had been angry, he would have drawn attention faster. Instead, he smiled. Television cameras loved Scott. He was articulate, soft-spoken, clean-cut. He made grief look composed. Public sympathy followed him, and that sympathy became his shield. While the city searched for Laci, Scott was quietly dismantling the version of himself investigators were beginning to question. This wasn't just a missing person case. It was a disappearance of a pregnant woman and her unborn child. Pressure mounted. The FBI became involved. Surveillance began, quietly, carefully. Scott didn't notice, or perhaps he did, and believed his role was convincing enough to carry him through. One detective would later recall watching Scott speak at a vigil. He said all the right words, the detective said, but he never said her name the way someone in love does. It wasn't evidence, but it was instinct. And instinct, in cases like this, often arrives before proof. Because Scott Peterson didn't hide from investigators. He embedded himself among them. He taught the public something unsettling. Sometimes the most dangerous person is the one asking for your help. By the first week of January, the search for Laci had transformed from urgent hope into disciplined scrutiny. Posters still lined the streets. Vigils still flickered at dusk. But behind closed doors, the tone had shifted. Investigators were no longer asking where is she, they were asking who benefits from her absence, and every answer circled back to the same man. Scott didn't notice a shift at first, or perhaps he did, and believed his calm demeanor could carry him through it. He continued to place himself front and center, thanking volunteers, granting interviews, offering timelines with confidence that bordered on rehearsed. That confidence would become his undoing. Investigators often say there are two kinds of suspects, those who refuse to speak and those who speak endlessly. Scott fell squarely into the second category. He volunteered details that weren't asked for. He corrected officers on minor points. He explained his movements with specificity, times, locations, even the weather. At first, that specificity seemed helpful. Then detectives began comparing notes. Different interviews produced slightly different versions of the same events. Departure times moved by minutes. Phone calls appeared and disappeared. Innocent people misremember details all the time, but patterns of selective precision are harder to ignore. Scott could recall the exact time he left the marina. He struggled to describe what Laci had been wearing. The fishing trip became the axis of suspicion. On Christmas Eve, Scott said, he drove nearly 90 miles to fish alone in the cold waters of the San Francisco Bay. It wasn't his usual spot. He didn't tell anyone beforehand. He didn't bring home fish. He didn't take photos. He did, however, keep the receipt for the boat launch. Investigators visited the marina. They studied the tides. They consulted experts who knew the bay's currents intimately. What they learned chilled them. Anything placed in those waters could travel far and quietly. As media coverage intensified, the public began noticing things investigators already had. Scott's language felt distant. He spoke about Laci in the past tense. He referred to the baby, Connor, not as a future son, but as an abstract loss. Viewers wrote letters. Callers phoned tip lines. Something's off, they said. Police never build a case on vibes, but they never ignore them either. Then came the revelation Scott could not control. Detectives uncovered phone records linking Scott to another woman, not a casual acquaintance, a romantic relationship that had begun weeks before Laci vanished. When confronted, Scott admitted the affair but minimized it. He framed it as brief, insignificant, already over. The problem wasn't the affair itself. It was what he had told the woman, that he was a widower, that his wife was already gone, weeks before Christmas, before anyone else knew Laci was missing. Infidelity does not equal murder, but lies establish motive, and motive establishes opportunity. Investigators now had a reason Scott might want a life without Laci and without a child, a future unburdened by responsibility, a clean slate. When police confronted him with this contradiction, Scott's calm faltered for the first time, not dramatically, just enough. With probable cause tightening, detectives placed Scott under discreet surveillance. He was followed to stores, to the marina, to quiet walks through his neighborhood. What they observed unsettled them. He researched tides. He returned repeatedly to the bay. He watched news coverage about the search. Intently, none of it was illegal. All of it was telling. Scott continued speaking publicly, perhaps believing transparency would save him. But each interview sharpened the contrast between his words and the evidence stacking quietly behind the scenes. When asked about Laci, his eyes drifted. When asked about Connor, his answers became abstract. Viewers noticed. So did the jury that would later watch those tapes. By mid-January, detectives had reached a consensus they could not yet prove. They believed Scott was responsible, not because of a confession, not because of a single piece of evidence, but because every path they followed ended at the same place. And every alternative explanation required coincidence after coincidence, while Scott's story required only one decision. Despite mounting suspicion, police did not arrest Scott. They waited, because cases like this are not won by speed. They are won by patience, by letting someone who believes they are in control continue talking, continue moving, continue making mistakes. One investigator would later write, "The hardest part was standing next to him, knowing what he'd done, and acting like we didn't. That restraint would matter, because the Bay was about to give up what it had been holding." By the spring of 2003, the investigation had narrowed to a single unbearable truth. one detectives had feared since the beginning. The calm man who stood beside them at vigils, who thanked volunteers and pleaded for prayers, was no longer simply a person of interest. He was the center of gravity. Everything pulled toward him, and then the water began to give answers. The San Francisco Bay is not a passive place. Its tides are aggressive, its currents complex, its depths unpredictable. For months, investigators had dreaded the same question. If evidence was here, would it ever return? They ran models. They consulted marine experts. They charted currents backward from where Scott claimed to have been fishing. One conclusion kept resurfacing. If something had entered the water near the marina on Christmas Eve, it could eventually surface anywhere. In April 2003, human remains were discovered along the shoreline near San Francisco Bay. The news reached investigators first, quietly, carefully. No press releases, no speculation, just a tightening silence as forensic teams worked. Soon after, additional remains were found nearby. The worst fear became reality. The remains were identified as Laci Peterson and her unborn son, Connor. For detectives, the moment was devastating, but clarifying, because what had once been theory was now fact. With the recovery of the bodies, the investigation shifted instantly. This was no longer a missing persons case. It was a homicide, and the timeline Scott had helped construct, his calm explanations, his fishing trip, his movements, now had to stand against physical reality. It didn't. The bodies surfaced in an area consistent with the tidal models investigators had been running for months, models based on Scott's own statements. The very detail he had offered to appear cooperative now anchored the case against him. His alibi had become his map. On April 18, 2003, Scott Peterson was arrested, not in Modesto, but near the Mexican border in San Diego. He carried thousands of dollars in cash, camping gear, multiple cell phones, a changed appearance. He told police he was going golfing. Investigators heard something else. Flight. The arrest stunned the public. The grieving husband had become the accused killer. News footage replayed his interviews endlessly. Every smile, every plea, every calm statement now viewed through a different lens. The performance was over, and the jury would see it all. Prosecutors laid out a case built on circumstantial evidence. Meticulous, layered, relentless. The affair, the fishing trip, the lies told before Laci vanished. The bodies surfacing where tides predicted. There was no confession. There didn't need to be. The story Scott had helped investigators tell was now being told back to him. Without mercy, Scott's defense argued media bias. They suggested alternative suspects. They questioned forensic certainty. But jurors returned again and again to one fact. Scott had positioned himself at the heart of the investigation, while quietly steering it away from himself, until he couldn't. In November 2004, Scott Peterson was found guilty of first-degree murder for Laci and second-degree murder for Connor. The courtroom was silent. For Laci's family, justice had come, but not closure, because no verdict restores what was taken. Because Scott Peterson didn't look like a monster. He looked like help, and that is what makes this case so unsettling. It teaches investigators and the public that danger does not always arrive with rage or chaos. Sometimes it arrives calm. Convictions feel final on television. In real life, they are only the beginning of a different kind of fight. When the verdict was read, guilty, many believed the story had reached its end. Scott Peterson was sentenced. The courtroom emptied and the public exhaled. The husband who had stood beside investigators was now a convicted killer. But for the families involved and for the justice system itself, the case refused to close quietly, because Scott Peterson did not stop performing. He simply changed the stage. From behind prison walls, Scott maintained his innocence. His legal team argued procedural errors, juror misconduct, and the influence of media coverage. They claimed the trial had been poisoned by public opinion long before evidence was weighed. To the families of Laci and Connor, these appeals felt like reopening a wound that had barely begun to scar. Every hearing required them to relive the same facts. Every motion resurrected the same lies. And yet, this is how the system works. Justice demands scrutiny, even when the truth feels obvious. Some crimes fade once a sentence is handed down. This one didn't. Scott Peterson's calm demeanor, even after conviction, continued to unsettle people. Supporters emerged online, dissecting evidence and proposing alternative theories. Detractors countered with timelines, tides, and testimony. The case became a mirror, reflecting how differently people interpret truth when a killer doesn't look like one. Years later, detectives who worked the case have spoken openly. They describe a man who understood optics, who knew how to behave, who recognized that cooperation creates trust, and that trust buys time. One investigator summarized it simply: he didn't outsmart us. He tried to outweigh us. The evidence didn't break because Scott confessed. It broke because reality eventually refuses to bend. For Laci's family, time has not softened the loss. Holidays remain fractured. Birthdays pass quietly. Connor exists only in memory, a life imagined, not lived. Justice did not restore what was taken. It only named the truth. And sometimes that is all the law can offer. Because Scott Peterson never ran. He stayed. He helped. He spoke. He taught the public a dangerous lesson. That evil doesn't always hide in shadows. Sometimes it stands under bright lights, asking for prayers. If Scott had stayed silent, if he had refused interviews, if he had avoided the search altogether, would the truth have come out sooner, or later, or at all? Do you believe justice was fully served in this case? Share your thoughts respectfully in the comments. If this story gripped you, like this video, subscribe to Unimaginable True Crimes. Turn on notifications so you don't miss the next investigation. Your support helps us tell the stories that refuse to be forgotten. If this case disturbed you, the next one is even harder to accept. A man exploited trust, planned in silence, and carried out a coordinated mass killing in Oslo and on Utoya Island. Watch the next investigation now.